Hi team, we are back on ELFH 312, and I would consider this a little bit beyond half the semester. And I figure I put this together. There's going to be a series of about 3 videos that you're going to see here. This one particularly talks about a quick revision of where we have been and where we are today and where we are headed as far as not only the content, our purpose, but also the deadlines. So let's start. What you have on the screen currently is the beginning of the different assignments we have done so far. If you think about it, we start, so let's put context to this conversation. The very first thing that I like to do is, like I mentioned, I want to cover where we have been, where we are today, and where we are headed after this point. All of it is related to the big context of this course. So the purpose of this course is for us to understand and learn better ways to create training. And if we already do it, just to see different applications and consider different things. This is not the be all end all, but absolutely we cover a lot of things that are going to be necessary for an effective training. So if we start from the very conceptual framework, and you saw it on the syllabus and we actually had a discussion about it, in order for us to put a training together, I call it a training solution. That's usually what I like to call it. We start by the learning theories, and we had a little conversation about the learning theories, right? The cognitivism, the behaviorism. We talked a little bit about the socialism and the constructivism. So you choose what theories are going to help you the best. One of the conclusions that we arrived as a class was we cannot select one single learning theory because we cannot expect that everybody at every single point in time are going to always construct knowledge on their own. Sometimes we're going to need to guide them a little bit. We're going to need to give them context. We're going to need to provide history and application. So that's a little bit of the cognitivism coming in. And we also talked about needing to allow for that behavior to take place, especially in soft skills. So you're going to need to present a scenario or something that will allow the participant to have a hands-on or demonstrate a different attitude or a different behavior. So hence the behaviorism. So that was the construct. Another thing we talked about was the difference between the pedagogy and the andragogy. And most academics don't really see a big difference about it, but I am very particular about it because while a lot of people say that they both basically do the same, and some other people say that we use pedagogy even in adult learning, I don't discount that. I don't disagree. I simply like to refine the idea a little bit better. And if you remember, I mentioned that andragogy is the science that focuses on the learning for adults. So the difference between pedagogy and the andragogy is that for adults, we don't want to just give them a ton of information that is probably going to be useless at the moment they consume it and clog their brains with a lot of information that is going to be trash at that moment. They will not consider it important. It will clutter their thinking process and their patience, and it's not going to do anything. So that's a part of where the andragogical perspective really comes in. So my other phrase for andragogy is the JIT, like we say in business, or the just in time. And that's essentially building training. We can always build it all in one sitting, but we are not going to execute all the learning for participants at the same time. We're going to give them little buckets of knowledge so they can consume it and apply it. Consume it and apply it. If we give them everything at once, they may apply only half of it, and then you can see the waste in there. So that's where the andragogy really kicks in. And I hope by now you have seen the implications of it. As a matter of fact, this course is outlined basically like that. Because you didn't hear me talk about objectives during the first or second night of class. Instead, we focused on the overall understanding. We talked about the theories. At the time, definitely that was needed, the framework. And then eventually, as we continued to progress, we talked about a little bit about the needs analysis. Then we talked about the learner analysis, the context analysis, etc. but we did it in chunks. Now, the difference here would be if you had completely freedom to do the order in which you so please, that would be more of a constructivism approach in this course. So every single piece of content would have been available from day one. But part of it is absolutely, I had not created some of the videos. But part of it is also the fact that I did want to apply more cognitivism, where I didn't want you to step ahead because I didn't necessarily have the span of control to provide you feedback if you were deciding to do the objectives on night 2, because I was still having to review the understanding of the learning theories, etc. So you not always use cognitivism only to prescribe a certain order, but sometimes you also use it to control what activities are going on for the learner, so that you as facilitator or as an educator can come back to them, or as a trainer can come back to them and make corrections, provide feedback, etc. So it's a huge game that goes into the andragogy. So we therefore shouldn't discount it, nor should we just wash it out under the pedagogy. Okay, so now that we have gone over that, that's the framework. Then we get into the artifacts, if you will. So now we are hired by a company, or we are in a department where they come to us and they say, I need you to create a learning solution. I need you to create training. Okay, so the first question, as you remember in the past, we asked, is it really training what you need? And is training going to solve this problem? So first we have to validate the problem or the need, and then we have to define whether the problem or the need is going to be solved with training. So that's where we land in what you see on the screen, the needs analysis. So we have completed that part. I asked you, think about what could be a potential solution. In reality, again, a department comes to you and they say we need to speed up the call handle time by 5 minutes. Or another business unit will come to you and say we need to improve the consumer experience or the customer experience by less complaints, by 50% less complaints. So if you notice, I'm giving you examples with metrics. The reason why we have metrics is because when you get to the evaluation, you can actually use the metrics to evaluate how well the training did. But in reality, unfortunately, we don't get metrics. Sometimes we just say we need more training on fill in the blank, and they don't give us anything else. So we don't really have much to go with. That's why the needs analysis is so important, because then we have to look at records, we have to interview people, we have to talk to clients, talk to the current people that are doing the work, etc. And once we have done that, we can then assess how much training is really going to solve the problem or not. And then we have a conversation with the client and we move forward. For the class, we did assume that whatever your project is needed to have training. Now, I will tell you a secret. Recalling some of the projects that you guys are going on, over from a return on investment perspective, there are some topics that might have been easier to address with a good communication. But once again, the purpose of our class is to have some hands-on experience. So all of the projects actually are going to work. I guess what I'm trying to say is we did not necessarily conduct a true needs analysis to validate the need for the training or the learning solution. But we're assuming that there was a need, so you guys began to work on that. So after the needs analysis, you moved on to the learner analysis. If you recall, the learner analysis is essentially to outline what is it that whom you are actually going to target. And the biggest point of memory here is, remember how depending on where you are, you may not be able to pinpoint exactly who your learner is going to be because you don't have them in front of you. You can't build a profile, especially if you're building a new hire training. We talked about that. In a new hire training, you will have people from the street that they may possibly fill a criteria, but you don't know. You don't know their age. You don't know what experience they have. prior experience. You don't know much of those things. So what we need to do sometimes in those cases is create a profile. Historically, we go to see who has been hired for X position. And then based on that, we create a profile that will be general for the most part, but at least it will give us the idea. Why is it important, especially nowadays? Everyone, I'm sure, have heard you all have heard about the millennials. So one of the biggest differences that if you go on Google and type millennial differences, you will find out that the millennials, in contrast with the Generation Xers or the baby boomers, the millennials like to have information in front of them all over the place. So think about a CNN kind of screen where you have the talking head, you have a scrolling marquee at the top, and then you have little scrolling bottom stories at the bottom, and then you have the banner with the stock prices running. And so there's a lot of information, and millennials are used to that, and they go from one thing to another, and it doesn't faze them. Whereas Generation Xers and Generation Baby Boomers, actually, uh, we like one thing at a time. We like to hear the talking head and then switch the screen and give me the banner with the stock prices and talk about the stock prices, and then switch the screen, and instead of giving me a scrolling marquee, give me a slide by slide or screen by screen of the stories that you are featuring, or something like it. So that's probably one of the most dramatic differences in the audiences that we may experience. That's why it's so important for us to know and conduct that learner analysis, so we can create the training in the most effective way to match as many of those participants as possible. So we did the learner analysis. Then we also talked about the context analysis. In the context analysis, the importance for it, I'm sorry, I'm having a little difficulties highlighting that. It's important to do the context analysis because what that does is it helps us understand not only where the learner is going to absorb the knowledge, but also where they are going to go apply it. So in some cases, and some of you experienced this, the delivery of the training is going to happen in the exact same place where they are going to work. And why is it important to know that? If you recall, kind of reminiscing from Dr. Shock's conversation before, if you're having a football team practice, you don't want to have them practice a football play in a gymnasium. They need to be in the field where the variables are exactly the same as the day of the game. That way there is no miscalculation. They know how much traction their shoes will have on the field, and so on and so forth. So similarly for the workers, when we are training them, we need to expose them to distractions. We need to expose them to systems. We need to expose them to what the most real experience is going to be in terms of content, in terms of them applying content. So context analysis, very important. That setting. Then we talked about the task analysis and the course outline. Well, let's start with the task analysis. You may recall that video that I shared with you from my colleague, again, Brad, where he was talking about peanut butter and jelly. And to me, that was probably the best example that I could possibly give you, because it's very simple, but at the same time is so true. So if we think about in terms of peanut butter and jelly for the different tasks we do, we're going to have an ability to understand a little bit better the order and the depth of knowledge we have to provide to people. Like you were saying, you have to know the consistency of the peanut butter. You have to have the consistency of the jelly. You have to understand that they both go together. You have to know what is it going to do, what instruments are you going to use to spread them, on what you can spread them, etc. So when you do a task analysis, you do have to break things apart. And so figuring out that problem. So if it's a call handle time reduction, or if it's a customer service satisfaction, we have to peel that onion out, and we have to look at the different layers and figure out what is it that is going to provide people the ability to do to provide better customer experience. So is it going to be the acknowledgement? Is it going to be proper language? Is it going to be buttoned up presence? We don't know. It all depends on the company. It all depends on the field. It all depends on the service and the product that the person is servicing. But we have to peel all of those things, and that's why we call it task analysis. Once we have the task analysis, we can build a course outline. And literally, like the phrase calls it, an outline is going to be just that. An outline. I am going to cover this. I am going to cover close, behavior, language. In the customer service example, I am going to cover hours. I am going to cover processes, systems, etc. Everything necessary to provide good customer service. You don't have to necessarily say what you're going to do with each one of those things, but you're going to tell me what those tasks are. So as you do the task analysis, you come up with this outline, and in the outline, not only are you outlining it, but you're also giving it an order. First, I need to talk about greeting the customer. Then I need to talk about inquiring what they need, and so on and so forth. So that's why the outline is so important. So you have completed that. And the most recent thing that you should have completed is the instructional objectives. If you remember, we talked about the TLOs and ELOs. TLO for Terminal Learning Objective and ELO for Enabling Learning Objective. So how do we marry this idea together with the tasks? So essentially, if you did a task analysis, and again, following up with the customer experience example, so we want to increase the ability of providing customer service. Say the complaints came around because people were not polite, because people were slow, and so on and so forth. So among your task analysis, you came up with manners, you came up with politeness or awareness of consumers, and techniques to ask questions, etc. So in your instructional objectives, so the goal is to provide excellent customer experience, and you can define what that looks like because we need to define it. That's the goal. To achieve that goal, we need terminal learning objectives. The first terminal learning objective is going to be provide courtesy to consumers. That could be a terminal learning objective. And of course, remember, when you're writing it, you need 4 components. You need the criteria, you need the context, you need who's going to perform it, you need the action, and then you need the criteria. How well are they going to do it? That's in the terminal learning objective. How do we provide that terminal learning objective that I just mentioned? We need to do different things. Number one, if we are finishing a task and the consumer is coming up to the front desk, acknowledge them. So how do we acknowledge a consumer? That can be a subtask. That could be an enabling learning objective. Another one is addressing the client. We're not going to be behind the front desk and say, hey man, hold on a second. Imagine that. That's not necessarily rude, but it's not appropriate when you're representing a company. So an enabling learning objective is going to teach that person, behavior-wise, how they should address the client. Yes, ma'am, or yes, sir. Give me 1 second. I will be with you shortly. Acknowledging their presence and addressing them adequately so they don't feel dismissed. And so that's an enabling objective, and so on and so forth. So if you remember, one of the biggest takeaways that I mentioned was there is no formula to specify how many terminal learning objectives or how many enabling objectives you can have. But usually what I try to guide people, because once you've done it several times, you will be able to guesstimate how many terminal learning objectives you can build. As far as enabling, again, there is no specific number, but there is a chance that there will be more enabling objectives than terminal objectives. Because the terminal objectives are going to be those bigger tasks, bigger things that you're going to do. And so my general recipe is try to think about chunks of time. If you can conduct a certain content in 15 minutes, that may embrace one terminal objective. Now that can be different depending on the complexity of the topic that you're trying to address. For example, a system. It may be that one terminal learning objective to learn the cash register may be as huge as operating the cash register. Well, for that, you're going to need several enabling objectives. One could be turning on the machine. Another one could be connecting it to the network. Another one could be entering your PIN so that the register knows that who you are, and so on and so forth. So you see the concept there. So you should have done those instructional objectives. And also the other thing that I asked you to add to that was the evaluation plan. During the week we were reviewing that prior to you submitting this. I asked you to tell me, so how will we know? So you remember we talked about Kirkpatrick, and Kirkpatrick proposes 4 different models. So we have the first model, or I'm sorry, the first level, which is that satisfaction. We literally want to know what people thought of the experience, and that's usually good if you are providing new training. If the group of people that you're providing training to is new. I'll give you a quick anecdote. My team created satisfaction. We began in 2011 in this particular team, and so I asked them to have a level 1 survey. Survey usually is what ends up taking the level 1, or smiley sheets as we call them as well. So they started doing that. So year 1 we achieved I think somewhere like 3.8 satisfaction, on a scale of 1 to 5. And then the next year, 2012 I believe, we went up to 4.0. And then the year after that, so 2013, we achieved a 4.5. After that we went to 4.8, and the year after that, so 2016 I believe, 2015 or 16, we stayed at 4.8. So at that point, we saw throughout the year, throughout the different offerings, we did not hit 5.0. And again, this is across all the different offerings that my team has. So we ask ourselves, what happened? Why can we not achieve a 5.0? So what we did is we conducted some analysis. So we set a focus group and we asked people. And so that gave us information. But my point is, on that level 1, we got to a point where we had such satisfaction that we felt it wasn't necessary for us to continue measuring it, because we knew that we were executing well with the clientele we had. So we stopped the level 1s. That's not common practice, but depending on how much work your team has, you can choose, or yourself, you can choose whether or not. My giveaway as an academic, I will tell you, it is important to build it. Now, how long do you run it? That's a different story. That will depend on operationally how your business is going to run. But in reality, you do want to make sure you have a level 1. Okay. Level 2. The level 2 is definitely going to be that assertion of, did you get what I was telling you? So kind of like if you go back to elementary school, middle school, high school, you had content and you had a test. You had content, you had a quiz. You had content and you had a mid-year or a mid-semester exam. And then you had a final exam, and so on and so forth. Exams, tests, quizzes. It's a little bit nerve-wracking, but necessary things. Well, in the world of adulthood, beyond the classes, we are going to assess that knowledge transfer, but we don't necessarily have to do it only via a quiz, test, or exam. We can also do it in other ways, like reflective papers, or anecdotes, or case studies. Read this case and tell me how you would behave, and then we give them 3 or 4 choices. Behind the mechanics is a multiple choice question, but we're asking people to analyze more information and then have a course of action versus just choosing a random A, B, C, D answer that it's 1 word or 2 words or true, false. It's bigger than that. So yes, it is a multiple choice, but it's in terms of a scenario. So it's a bigger thought process. So I wouldn't necessarily call that a test, but you can do that. Case studies, etc. Then you have level 3. Oh, by the way, level 2s, we don't do surveys for level 2s. A survey, by definition, and I have seen some of you use this term inappropriately, a survey cannot be a test, cannot measure the knowledge acquisition by any means. It's not designed to do that. It shouldn't do that. So for a knowledge acquisition assessment or a level 2, like I said, you should have some form of test or instrument that allows you to measure how much does a person know about something. So be careful with that. Level 3, however, oh, and by the way, I'm sorry, I keep going back to that level 2. An idea that was great that I saw many of you talk about, you can build a pre-test and a post-test, not pre-survey and post-survey. It's a pre-test and a post-test. You can do that because what that will do is you will measure how much the person knew before your intervention, do the intervention, and then you will measure how much they know after the intervention. That usually gives you that differentiation, the variation of the content that you delivered. So that's also measuring how well did it stick. Okay, so finally moving to level 3. Level 3 is definitely seeing the transfer. Okay, so you told me the training was great. You had a good time in the classroom or in the training center. And then you also told me that, yep, you can make better decisions based on the content I gave you. Great. But then the level 3 is really, can you go now do your job based on what you told me you know? Based on the fun you had in the classroom? Well, let's see. So that level 3 usually is that observation. A preceptor that sits with that person and goes, well, show me how you ring up this return from the customer. Let me observe and see how you greet this customer that is coming to place a complaint because of a product broke day 2, etc. So that's a preceptor or a coach, if you will. Sometimes you simply measure. Well, we taught you how to do customer service. You have covered all the content. We're going to put you to provide customer service day 1. And we're going to ask every customer that you service to fill out a quick 5-question survey asking whether or not they had their issue resolved and if they are satisfied with how you provided customer satisfaction. So if we get absolutely no complaints or high marks, or if we get high marks, then that tells us that you took the content and you executed well. There is a place that I go to normally. I can't think of right now what business it is, but we consume from a lot of places. But one of Amazon. Every time you order from Amazon, at least I have ordered from Amazon, they send me a survey asking how was the experience ordering and how was the experience receiving the product. So obviously they are looking at those two because there was training, I'm sure, for people to build that ordering experience via the web, and then there was also training for people to do the shipping in a timely manner after the order was placed, because that's not all computers. There's got to be a person behind that. So they are obviously measuring those two, and so we get that information behind it. So that's the level 3. And then the level 4, which many of you chose not to do, and I don't blame you for that, because even I said the level 4 in learning is very difficult to achieve, because at that point you do have to measure. You did the training. It cost you, say, to implement the training, and just to throw some numbers out, it cost you $10,000 to train people on the customer experience, because you had to give them breakfast, lunch, print materials. You brought somebody from the outside to do a facilitation. You paid designers like yourselves to build the training, etc., etc. So all said and done, $10,000. Employees now are providing customer experience, and that $10,000 may translate to fewer complaints on poor customer experience. Great. But that doesn't really give the company money directly back. What it does is it provides this sense of satisfaction. There is the logic of the less people complain about it, the more purchasing they're going to do, or the more consumption of the service they're going to do. That's great. But there's no direct correlation, because the training went well. We spent $10,000. The company is getting back $15,000, $20,000. It's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison. So that's why it's so difficult to measure the return on investment when you talk about training. Now, there are some other instances where actually it is true. I'll give you one quick one. If you're training agents to do selling, and their previous selling was hitting only the benchmark of $15,000 a month. You provided training, and that's the only thing you did. You didn't change processes, you didn't change anything. There was no upset in the market, there was no competition change, there was nothing else. Just the training. That's pretty difficult to narrow down. And then the following month they are registering $20,000 in sales. Then you can more likely say that the training had a big impact on the return on investment for that unit. So that's why it's so important to define what our evaluation strategy is going to be. Okay, so that's where we are up to this point. Now, what is coming up? You have all the components basically now to begin working on your training. And this is probably the most time consuming part, and you have to be careful. There's going to be another video that I am going to go and I'm going to compare two different training materials so you can have an idea of not only the quality that I am looking and I am hoping you guys get out of this course, but also so you can understand why it's important to have some components. So right from this point forward, for the rest of the class, now you have all the basic knowledge. Now you're going to put together the task analysis that you did, the objectives, the assessment strategy that you have, and you're going to now put together a 4-hour training module and presentation. And by the way, the presentation we're going to do something different with it. So be in the lookout for an announcement from me on Blackboard about what the presentation is going to look like. But let's focus on the 4-hour training module. So on the training module, what I am asking for is literally you're going to deliver to me all the necessary materials as if I were the facilitator, and you're going to say, Hardy, here's the materials for this class, please go execute, go teach, go train. And I should be able to read it. I may have very few questions. I should not need this subject matter expert person, and all my questions should be answered from the materials you give me. That means you're going to give me a participant guide so that I can distribute that on. You're going to give me a facilitator guide that is going to have instructions on how I should use the participant guide, what to tell the participants to do with it. And potentially, depending on the topic, you may give me charts, job aids, flip charts, images, small graphics, links to videos, websites to go look at, and questions to ponder based on what the website is offering, and potentially a PowerPoint deck. It's not necessary. None of what I mentioned is required when it comes to all those other materials, but depending on what you're training, you're definitely going to need some materials. So once again, think about it. I don't know necessarily the material, the knowledge. I don't have the knowledge you have about the subject. But yet you're building a training so that you can give it to somebody else so they can execute on it. So this is going to be the real test. When you give me this 4-hour training, I should be able to see it. And if I devote time, I should be able to learn it and then deliver it. So that's going to be the test. And of course, I'll provide you feedback on that. Once you have done that, it's all really simple. It's mainly putting things together. As I'm scrolling down, basically you're going to put together the 4-hour training plan. What is that? By the way, this is not the hat. The training plan essentially is just that. It's the plan. It's everything. It's the entire package. In the plan, all you do is you put the two things together. So all the materials that you put together, the needs analysis, the context analysis, the learner analysis, the task analysis, the outline, the objectives, the evaluation strategy. Put it all together. And then below that, or as an appendix, you give me the participant guide, facilitator guide, decks, job aids, videos, website links, everything you created. All of that is one single package. And then that is your 4-hour training plan. The plan is everything. Okay? So I hope that helps, and I will, in other videos, you will probably see, without the probably, you will see what some elements of training exist in a real training today. So until next time, I hope you guys, if you have any questions, you ask me via the discussion board. Have a great day.